Recently, a file said to be buried for decades inside Los Angeles County's records surfaced without warning. It didn't contain scripts or contracts. It held cold clinical reports on the bodies of Hollywood's brightest lights. Across the pages ran a pattern that was hard to ignore: traces of injections where there shouldn't have been any, signs of secrets carried to the grave, bodies worn down by pills that once kept cameras rolling, and damage no one could see from a red carpet. If you think fame softens the end, these pages say otherwise, and the deeper you go, the darker it gets. Some were allegedly pushed by power to keep quiet. Others carried invisible harm that would take decades to show itself. A few tried to escape time with medicine that belonged in the shadows. By the end, one question lingers: what was true, what was rumor, and why did so much of it have to be hidden? Until after the final curtain. Marilyn Monroe's address in Brentwood looked like any quiet hill street, the kind of place where the night sits still. The lights of an ambulance broke that calm. Neighbors crowded the gate while officers pushed through a locked door. Inside, the bedroom was set with a stillness that felt arranged. She lay on the bed, a hand near the receiver of a phone as if a call had slipped from her. The mass of the public would be told it was a night of despair. Yet the clinical lines on a report raised a harder puzzle. The numbers for sedatives in blood and liver were sky high. Her stomach, however, was empty. No fragments, no residue. Nothing that should appear if a handful of capsules had gone down moments before. That's when whispers started. If the drug didn't pass through the mouth, how did it get in? A few suggested a needle. Others said a method that leaves fewer traces. People began repeating a claim that she kept a little red notebook brimming with things she shouldn't have heard. Big names, deep rooms, conversations about events that could rattle nations. She had dazzled the most guarded men in America. Those men had secrets to protect. Was this a tragic choice made alone, or a scene crafted to look like it? The public never received a final answer. The case closed, the questions didn't. Fans flocked to the Brentwood home, tears on a front walk where cameras clicked like insects in the dark. What stayed behind was a paradox. She was the woman who made the world bright, and her last room felt too tidy to be real. It didn't prove anything. It only refused to let the story go. 3 years later, the sound of metal on metal echoed along a lonely highway, and another icon slipped out of life with brutal speed. James Dean called his little silver Porsche the name everyone still remembers, a dare stamped across a hood he shouldn't have tested. The crash tore the frame apart and flung pieces like shrapnel. In the quiet of a morgue far from the noise of premieres, the damage was written in terms that make the heart sink: a neck that gave way, a chest broken, a face no longer the one that stared into a lens like it was a mirror for his soul. But the wreckage of the body was not the only thing people talked about. Another set of papers, another locked drawer, letters, photographs, notes were said to have vanished in the week after his death. Friends told friends about nights that didn't fit studio gloss. He was a rebel on screen. Yes, but off-screen he carried a softness he couldn't show to the world. He worked for. He sought warmth in the quiet. He reached for people who understood him when the crowd didn't. Names swirled, but the rumors always said the same thing. The industry wanted a legend, not a complicated young man. So when the body was claimed and the car became a relic, the life itself was neatened for the public. You don't bury mystery so easily, you only feed it. Elizabeth Taylor didn't leave in an instant. She waged a long battle with a body that had absorbed too many knives and too much pain. The pages describing her heart read like a siege map. Enlarged, thickened, marked by earlier fights. Surgeons had tried to fix what time and illness kept undoing. Her file, what the public never saw while she smiled and glittered, listed procedures most people can't imagine enduring once, let alone again and again. On top of it sat the price of stardom's mirror, work done to keep the face everyone knew, the outline the public demanded. The notes hinted at treatments the world didn't hear about at the time. The scars that a camera hides don't go away. They just move out of view. She had enchanted the public for decades and paid for that gift in ways no one could see under diamonds. She didn't vanish quickly. The end arrived like a long dusk. When it finally settled, people mourned the woman with the violet eyes. Few understood what her doctors had been fighting all along. She didn't lose one war. She survived dozens until the last one. Marlon Brando's voice could fill a room with gravity. In the late footage, he wore suits with room to spare, and his words still carried weight. The record said something else. It described a body at odds with itself, lungs punished by a habit that the old studio system had packaged as masculine, a liver telling its own story, signs of procedures that don't make the front page when a star chooses privacy over explanation. If there were efforts to undo years of strain with operations in quiet clinics, they didn't restore the man on the posters. They weren't meant to. They were meant to keep the rest of life bearable. People want titans. The body doesn't honor those requests. On screen, he was the man who never flinched. In real life, he was doing what millions do, seeing doctors, making choices, trying to ease pain, and asking time for a little mercy. If the scars were many, it only proved he kept fighting. Paul Newman's eyes were a color the world never forgot. The camera loved the cigarette that so often hung in the same frame. The smoke looked cool. It also worked like a tide wearing rock to sand. In the end, when doctors looked inside, they didn't find stardom. They found the result of a ritual that America once learned from its movies. The tissue had turned the color no one wants to see. The airways told a story of years measured in puffs, not breaths. He had the grace to warn people with a line he left behind. If this is the way I go, let it be a lesson. He didn't scold. He held his ground and spoke softly. Even then, the warning stood. The image of him with a cigarette still circulates like a postcard from a country that kept telling itself smoke only rises in the air and never settles in the lungs. Where Newman's end felt like a slow march, Steve McQueen's looked like a last stand in a makeshift room far from the best hospitals in the world. He had an illness that cuts deep and late, a slow-moving enemy seated by old work in old places. He wanted time. The people in white coats in the biggest buildings shook their heads. They said no knife would help, so he crossed a border. He lay down under lamps that flickered, not the theater kind but the kind that hums when it's tired. He trusted a plan that wouldn't pass the tests in a modern center. The cut was long, the stitching was rough. The hope was brave. It didn't hold. The people who loved him brought him back across lines in a quiet box. On a table where the air sits cold, the signs of the last attempt were hard to look at. No one doubts why he tried. The will to stay is the last thing to let go. Humphrey Bogart had a voice that carried like gravel under a wheel, and a look the public copied without question. He spent years with a cigarette where a tie pin might go, a kind of badge he wore, as naturally as a suit. When disease found the one place that makes swallowing possible, the habit he'd leaned on for decades held the door open. Near the end, food didn't make the trip past the throat. The weight fell off fast. The frame sharpened to bone on the table. The man who had once defined cool looked like wind could move him. The tissue of the lungs turned dark. The smell told a story before the words did. People lined the streets with tearful faces and lit cigarettes at the same time. They meant it as a tribute. It was also a grim irony. Clark Gable was the kind of star the world calls a king, and he carried the crown like it weighed nothing. In the last stretch of work, the set was hot with pressure. He put out fires, kept pace, did the job as he always had. Caffeine for speed, smoke for steadiness, long days linking to longer nights. When the pain in his chest came, it didn't whisper. By the time doctors traced the cause, they found the lines that limit blood had narrowed hard. The muscle at the center of everything had been overworked, long before it signaled. They opened the chest and saw age where the calendar said, there shouldn't be that much. Some men break from an accident, others from a war you can't see. He was the second kind. He made the world swoon, then left it with a lesson no one wants to learn in time. Judy Garland's first great role made her look like hope itself. She was a child in a dress and shoes a color from dreams. The studio loved the image and protected it with a harsh routine. They gave her pep for the days that never seemed to end, and quiet for the nights that came too late. What begins as management can become dependence. Years pass. Pills stack. The body bends around the schedule it wasn't built to keep. She tried to hold a life together with music and work and a heart that felt too much. By the time the last room closed around her, she was a grown woman whose frame looked like a teenager, who hadn't eaten in days. Chemistry that once kept call times became a force she couldn't walk away from. She was one of the first to pay for a system that prized a product more than a person. The debate it started never really ended. Natalie Wood's name fits on a theater marquee like it was made for it. She wore grace like a fragrance. She also carried fear of deep water, that she spoke about often. The night she left a boat and didn't return, the sea was all edge and whisper. Morning light found her near land that couldn't help her. In the reports, marks appeared that don't belong to someone who simply slipped and sank. Fresh bruising here, another there, a long line on the shin that looked like contact with something hard. People aboard the boat gave stories that didn't match cleanly. The public wondered. The case shifted years later from one form of end to another. Because the pieces wouldn't sit still. No one wrote the final answer. The water keeps secrets the land can't coax out. All of these lives left behind the same riddle. How do you square the dream a studio sells with the body that has to live it? Stars stand under hot lights. They work past midnight. They lean on what gets them through. They keep secrets because the machine they feed can't run on human mess. They go where they're told, even if the ground once shook there in ways that never fully stop. They put beauty on layaway and pay the bill at the end. In the pages no one reads until a drawer gets opened by accident or design. You see it plain. Fame is a bargain that collects in private. The bill is always due. The file that sparked all these questions doesn't argue for one conspiracy or one single villain behind every last breath. It draws a darker, simpler picture. Studios, pressures, habits packaged as glamour, medicine used like a bandage on a wound that needs surgery, treatments made in shadows when the clock outruns hope, and places that looked safe until a number of sick people proved otherwise. The names change. The pattern repeats. You don't need to accept every rumor to feel the weight of the pattern. You only need to notice how often the body tells the truth the image refuses to admit.